Nations that cannot protect their skies cannot protect their future. With the conflicts that took place in the late 20th century, air threats on a world scale increased with the development of technology. Both air defense systems and air threat elements have developed in these days of the most violent conflicts of the 21st century. Air defense systems once again emphasized their importance in the relentless war between Russia and Ukraine. Many air defense systems, especially the S-300 batteries, are among the issues that occupy the agenda. Especially Ukraine's shooting of Russian S-300 batteries gives Putin a cold shower effect. Let's take a closer look at how Ukraine neutralized Russian air defense systems. The Ukrainian war continues with fierce clashes on the eastern and southern front lines. The new developments on the southern front line reveal the impasse of the Russian army. The Ukrainian military has released a new video claiming it shows the destruction of a Russian air defense battery in southern Ukraine. The video was first shared on the official Facebook page by the Southern Operational Command Formation of the Ukrainian Army. The video shows the wreckage, which initially looked like some kind of truck. In the later minutes of the video, a large number of burned and smoking debris can be seen. The post claimed that the targets were a battery of S-300 surface-to-air missile systems operated by Russian forces. The statement said that while performing fire missions, Ukrainian missile and artillery units destroyed an S-300 air defense system battery near Zelino. Krapinsk-Zelino Tropica is located in Ukraine's Kherson Oblast, one of the southernmost regions of the country. The region is located just north of the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. The Russian forces who wanted to achieve an important success on the southern front line were shot in the heart. The cost of Russia's S-300 air defense system is $115 million, not only in terms of financing, but also in the field of air dominance. Russia has lost a lot of credibility with these attacks, but on paper, the Russian army has the best arsenal against airstrikes. One of the batteries of multi-layer surface-to-air missiles capable of detecting and destroying the best-known systems, aircraft and ballistics, is the S-300. What is the S-300 air defense system? The S-300 anti-air missile systems are Soviet-era military technology introduced nearly 40 years ago with a targeting range of only 75 miles. A workhorse of Soviet and Russian air defense, the system is considered Russia's closest counterpart to the U.S. Patriot air and missile defense system. Various elements of the S-300 include a long-range surveillance, radar engagement, radar and launch vehicles, as well as a command vehicle capable of controlling the entire S-300 battery. Both Moscow and Kiev use the S-300 during their current conflict in early July. Modern ammunition was exhausted due to the protracted conflict in Ukraine. It has been reported that Russian forces are becoming increasingly dependent on such outdated equipment. 6 attacks on Mykolaiv over the first weekend of July were attributed to S-300 missiles. At the same time, it was reported that Russia was increasingly relying on Kh-32 missiles, which were originally designed to sink ships. Versions of the air-to-air missiles were used for attacks on the Kremenchuk shopping center in June, which killed 18 people, and on an Odessa apartment complex which killed 20. Despite the original intentions of these weapons, the Russian forces, whose stocks were dwindling, had to rely on the S-332s to hit ground targets. To do this, they were equipped with GPS systems that allowed them to be roughly guided to military targets. While Russia lost its S-300 batteries, Belarus began training on nuclear-capable missiles. Belarusian troops are trying to distract the Ukrainian troops on the northern border of the country. Belarusian forces are training to use nuclear-capable Iskander ballistic missiles. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced on its official Telegram channel that the Belarusian crew had been trained in the use of Iskander short-range ballistic missiles capable of low-yield nuclear fire in the southern military district of Russia since the beginning of April. In the Telegram post, it was reported that special attention was paid to the further development of practical skills. ILs in preparing the missile system for use, training for deployment, and conducting combat training launches. As a reminder, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced in March that tactical nuclear weapons would be deployed to Belarus. The announcement was interpreted as the Kremlin's latest attempt to weaken the West's support for Ukraine using the nuclear threat. Vladimir Putin did not say when the weapons will be transported to Belarus. Putin said that a storage facility for warheads will be completed in July. The president stated that Russian forces will also train their Belarusian counterparts in the use of ballistic missiles and modified Su-24 aircraft that can be used to deliver warheads to the target. The announcement was met with international condemnation even from China, which has so far been sympathetic to Moscow's war against Ukraine. The Belarusian opposition condemned the country's president, Alexander Lukashenko, and Putin for putting the country in the line of fire in any future direct conflict between Russia and NATO. A senior opposition official also stated that any nuclear deployment on Belarusian soil would lead to an increase in anti-Lukashenko partisan activity. Franek Vyakorka, chief political advisor to Belarusian opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, said the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons could make life more difficult for Lukashenko. Also, Ukrainian and foreign officials have suggested that the continued Russian presence in Belarus is intended to distract Kiev, which is planning its spring counterattack, which is expected to focus on the eastern or southern fronts. Ukraine and its foreign partners hope that, as with the previous counterattack, operations around Kiev in the spring of 2022 and around Kharkiv and Kherson in the fall, the next offensive will liberate important lands. Ukraine is keeping secret where the counterattack operations will begin. However, experts predict that the counterattack will begin on the southern front line. The developments in the Dnipro River confirm this prediction. According to conflict analysts, Ukrainian troops managed to cross the Dnipro River in the south of the country for the first time since the beginning of the Russian invasion. Russian war correspondent Romanov confirmed that the Ukrainian armed forces had landed on the left bank of the Dnipro in the Kherson region. A group of up to 30 Ukrainian soldiers landed on the left bank of the Dnipro. Ukrainian troops occupied a beachhead for new offensives deep in the Kherson region, according to a Russian military correspondent. The Ukrainian army is currently on the coastline and is probably preparing to further strengthen their position, according to the information given by Romanov. The positions of the Ukrainian army on the left bank of the Dnipro are relatively close to the positions of the Russian army. Until now, information about the presence of the Ukrainian army on the left bank of the Kherson region was very controversial. However, no official statement has been made yet from the Ministry of Defense on this matter. Crossing the Dnipro is crucial to the Ukrainian military's goal of controlling Crimea, which Moscow annexed 9 years ago. Ukrainian troops aim to advance about 161 kilometers south of the river, at least as far as annexed Crimea. This breakthrough comes just after rumors of a partial withdrawal from Russia's Kherson region. On the other hand, according to the reports of the Institute for War Studies, Ukrainian forces established positions near the town of Oleshki across the Dnipro Delta from Kherson. According to the report, Ukrainian forces are advancing towards the nearby village of Dapchi. It is also claimed that Ukrainian troops held these positions for several weeks and secured supply lines. This claim also shows that there is no Russian control in the region. In summary, Russia has deployed a large number of S-300 and S-400 air defense systems, as well as electronic intelligence and radar systems. In many regions, they would normally be expected to detect and destroy any aircraft in the air covering most of Ukraine. Russia similarly has several systems along the Ukrainian border and in Belarus. Despite all these possibilities and capabilities, there was a significant weakness in providing air dominance from the first day of the war. This makes us think that Russia is not planning a full operation or has a weakness in this direction. The fact that Kiev also hit the S-300 batteries strengthens this possibility. Can Russia win the dominance of the skies in the coming days? Russian forces have deployed their most elite Wagner units to cut off Ukrainians from two sides. However, Ukrainians took extraordinary measures to make flank attacks too costly. And given that Ukrainians started leaving their positions inside the city, Russians tried to quickly fill the void and capitalize on the momentum only to find themselves entangled in the high losses. Urban fights. Last time I told you that Ukrainians managed to stop Russian advances after reinforcing their flank significantly. I also told you that Ukrainians have finally started withdrawing from their town and that they have already left the eastern bank of the river and the southern part of the town. Right now, the most intense fights are taking place on the outskirts of the city. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians had substituted the retired forces with fresh ones from Chechnya and Sloviansk for conducting limited counter-offensive operations. And so far it looks like they are successful. If previously Russians reported huge difficulties associated with further advancement than today, some Russian sources started to report about the unsustainability of the same intensity of attacks and that Russians left some positions. It is highly unlikely that Ukrainians are trying to recapture vast swaths of land given the current weather conditions. It looks like Ukrainians just improved their fire control over the fields and made certain Russian positions simply untenable with increased fire. Russian forces pulled back to more reliable positions. And this is where Russians started having the biggest problems. By stepping back, the concentration of their forces increased, which means that Russians became significantly more vulnerable to artillery and air strikes. In fact, many Russian sources confirmed today that Ukrainians concentrated their artillery fire on the flanks and also continuously engaged at least 6 assault helicopters to bomb Russian strongpoints. If we take into account the fact that Wagner forces engaged their most elite formations to complete what they thought would be the final step of encircling Bakhmut, then we can see that Wagner forces are likely incurring high losses of the most capable troops. That is why the head of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, said today that Ukrainians are setting the conditions to block Wagner forces. He said that in order to avoid it, Wagners need more ammunition, and most of all, seek your flanks. Prigozhin's panic is justifiable because starting from the second half of March, the weather is expected to improve very rapidly. And given that the Wagners have overstretched their forces by widening the front line, there is plenty of weak spots in their flanks. That is why he said that if the Russian Ministry of Defense fails to ensure that they together tackle this problem, then Wagner forces are, quote, screwed. But it looks like defeating Russian flank attacks is only one part of the Ukrainian plan. As you remember, the second part of the plan is to impose more beneficial for the Ukrainians rules of the game, which is urban fighting, widening the corridor for withdrawal. Limited withdrawals themselves and continuous urban fighting are not mutually exclusive goals. Ukrainians are fighting inside the town while gradually stepping back as they step back. They shorten the front line, and a shorter front line requires fewer troops to protect it, so they conduct yet another limited withdrawal through the protected corridor. Ukrainian Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council recently said that by leveraging their fortified positions inside Bakhmut, for every loss, Ukrainians are inflicting 7 losses to the Russians. That is why, as many of you duly noted, the battle for Bakhmut is less about defending the city and more about bleeding Russians out. Overall, the Ukrainians are succeeding in imposing their rules of the game. They have reinforced the flanks and leveraged the bad weather to prevent the encirclement of the city. They have incentivized Russians to commit more resources to urban fights by slowly withdrawing and creating the void that Russians tried to fill, which led to more urban fights, a higher concentration of Russian forces that suffer from artillery and air strikes, and faster depletion of the most capable Russian assault units. All armies are made up of young soldiers, with few exceptions. All these armies are composed of male soldiers in times of war. Young men are the first to be called up because young men are the most advantaged group in terms of physical strength. But sometimes there is something more important than being young. Being brave. A brave man in Ukraine inflicted great damage on the Russian army. A 64-year-old Ukrainian citizen carried out an extraordinary operation against the invasion of the Russian army. Ukraine is talking about this manual. A Ukrainian soldier named Valentin Dyatkovsky single-handedly carried out an extraordinary operation. He told the details of this operation on a radio program broadcast in Ukraine. Ikolsky actually decided not to tell anyone about this operation, so he kept it a secret for months. But then he thought that this story would inspire Ukrainian soldiers, so he told everything on his radio program. The Turkovsky's story goes like this. At the beginning of the Russian military occupation of Ukraine, there was great uncertainty. Didkovsky wanted to resist the Russian soldiers occupying his town, but he did not want to risk the lives of civilians. So he decided to act alone. He planned what he could do. The Russian army was in a panic. The inexperienced soldiers had many weaknesses in the control and transfer of ammunition. Didkovsky needed weapons to resist the invaders and decided to steal them from the Russian soldiers. He sneaked up to the trucks of the Russian army carrying ammunition. He walked quietly through the fields and arrived at the military truck. There were no weapons in the truck, only many bombs. Didkovsky sneaked away with as many bombs as he could carry. Now he could move on to the second stage of the plan. He waited for the right moment to inflict maximum damage with these bombs. For this, he needed a powerful explosion. He started to secretly monitor all the movements of the Russian soldiers. He noticed that there were vehicles delivering natural gas to the Russian army at regular intervals. Now, his target was clear. As a result of his constant surveillance, Didkovsky discovered when the gas was being transferred to the Russian army. He made preparations before the transfer took place again. He put on his green clothes and crawled through the tall grass in the field. When he reached the closest point to the Russian soldiers, he waited. His breathing and heartbeat quickened. He knew that if he succeeded in this operation, he would do great harm to the Russian army. But if he was caught, he would be killed. The old hero risked everything to defend his country. After a while, he realized that the gas tanker was approaching the military base. Now it was time for an operation. Didkovsky was ready to make his move. When the tanker pulled up next to the armory, he looked at the bombs in his hand and at the gas tanker. He thought about the distance. It would be very difficult to hit the target at this distance, but there was no way he could get any closer. He gathered his courage and decided to throw these bombs. The first bomb he dropped landed right next to the tanker full of ammunition. After the explosion, all the Russian soldiers started to run away in panic. No Russian soldier had expected such an operation. They couldn't understand where the bomb was dropped from. But this farm had not. The fuel tanker, one of the tankers full of ammunition, started to burn, but it was not a strong fire. Now the Bekas had no chance to escape. He decided to try again. He threw the second one with all his might. Didkovsky was in a state of great excitement. Either he was going to die or he was going to be a great hero. He was experiencing an incredible burst of emotion as he looked at the bomb he had thrown. This bomb landed next to the exhaust pipe of the Russian tanker. Within seconds, it exploded and caused the gas tanker to explode. There was a very violent explosion and the vehicles burst into flames. The Russian soldiers couldn't believe it. Many of the soldiers near the military vehicles were dead, but the surviving soldiers started to open fire. The Sikorsky felt great pride and joy that he had carried out a successful operation. But at this moment, he locked eyes with a Russian soldier, noticing that Didkovsky, the Russian soldier, opened fire at him and called out to his comrades. Didkovsky thought he was going to die, but if he died, he would die a hero because the operation had succeeded. But the old wolf did not give up. The last bomb he had was a gas bomb because he had only 3 bombs from the Russian army and he planned to use the gas bomb to escape. He pulled the pin and threw the gas pump into the fence between the field and the Russian base. As soon as the gas came out of the bomb, the Russian soldiers could no longer locate him. The Sikorsky stood up. He had to run for a long distance. For years, his whole body was not so strong, but this time he had to run to survive. And that's what he did. But just running was not enough. He kept changing his direction to avoid being shot by the Russian soldiers. The gas bomb took 25 seconds to release all the gas. He had to get out of sight before the time was up for a 64-year-old. This was not easy, but Vitkovsky believed he could do it. He started running. Meanwhile, the sound of bullets was coming closer and closer. Many bullets were passing close to him. The only thing he could do was to run. So he ran. When the gas pump started to run out of gas, the Russian soldiers could see him from far away. One Russian soldier had his binoculars on. He aimed at Ditkovsky and started shooting because he realized that the bullets were not passing much closer to him. He was running, constantly changing direction. When a bullet grazed his shoulder, he realized he was bleeding, but he kept running. After a while, he threw himself to the ground and tried to roll sideways. Now he was lost among the tall saplings in the field. The Russian soldiers couldn't see him. He had reached the final stage of the plan. He put his old motorcycle right next to the field because he knew that the Russian soldiers would follow him and find him in the field. When the Russian soldiers started running towards him, there was only one thing he had to do. He had to get on his motorcycle and get away from the area. He got on his old 1997 motorcycle and stepped on the gas. He was a hero. Now, he felt a great euphoria riding his motorcycle against the wind. He knew he was one of the bravest people in the world. He rode his bike and left the area where he lived. Then he crossed into the area under the control of the Ukrainian army. He was saved. Ditkovsky recounted these moments on his radio program, and host was mesmerized. In these moments, the ratings of the radio program were skyrocketing. Ukrainian citizens were very proud to hear this great story. There were thousands of posts about this event on social media. Ditkovsky became the talk of Ukraine. The Ukrainian press claims that Ditkovsky will soon be awarded at a ceremony. Allegedly, this award will be given by Ukrainian President Zelensky. After this story of Ditkovsky, many news appeared in the Ukrainian press around this time. The explosion at the Russian base was confirmed. However, the Russian government claimed that the explosion was an accident. After the truth came out, the Russian government was once again the subject of ridicule. In Ukraine, Ditkovsky killed many soldiers in the Russian army. In this operation, he succeeded in destroying the ammunition of the Russian army and gave the Russian soldiers a great shock. After describing the success, he did great damage to Russia's reputation. He also raised the hopes of Ukrainian citizens. What do you think about Ditkovsky's great heroic story? Do you think a movie will be made about this event? What are your thoughts about a 64-year-old doing such an operation? How do you think this operation affected the course of the war?